So these are going to be the top 10 decks after the Death Knight event has happened, and overall, the meta has actually shifted quite a bit to the point where Enrage Warrior might genuinely be the best deck, or at least a top 3 deck in the game right now. Animated Berserker as a 1-drop 1/3 to just constantly damage your minions actually makes it a lot more reliable to trigger things like the Crazed Wretch, as well as the Imbued Axe to pump up more things. You can also, if you want, run a version of this deck that runs the Draw Weapons card, which is the Forge of Souls. You don't have to. You could potentially still rely on Weapons Expert, but it really comes down to you which one you want. Overall, the addition of this one card and the meta shifting has allowed for this deck to really take hold and do really, really well. I've been absolutely loving it. People have been memeing on Warrior for a long time, and it's genuinely like the 3rd highest win rate class in the game right now. Next, I might be a little bit biased, but it's going to be Beast Hunter. I'm saying this because Deathstalker Rexxar is like my favorite card of all time. Beast Hunter is still a super high win rate deck. It's got good tempo, it's got pretty good late game, it's got even better late game now that Deathstalker Rexxar exists. And it has pretty decent responses to most things. For example, you have the Tarantula, which spawns poisonous minions that can help deal with Res Priest. Not to mention you can build beasts that silence things from Res Priest. You have good enough aggro in early games where you can beat things like Druid. It's just a really good, well-rounded deck that has very few weaknesses and a great closer in Denathrius. You really can't go wrong with this deck. It's a bit expensive, but again, very strong. So the next deck on the list is going to be Beast Druid. This deck costs less than a singular legendary. So not only is it the best budget deck in the game by far, but it also has the 3rd highest win rate in the game just in general according to Hearthstone Replay, which means it's a top 3 deck in the game. I will admit it is a little bit straightforward. The idea is to basically just fill your board with 1 and 2 drops, as you can see 16 1-drops, and then pump them up with Herald of Nature, Pride's Fury, as well as Sow the Soil, and maybe something you get off of Planted Evidence. So yes, it's pretty simple. If your board gets wiped, it feels bad, but overall, considering the fact that it has an insane win rate, it's great on a budget, and it only starts falling off in win rate once you get to top 1000 legend, this is a great deck for pretty much everyone. The next deck on the list is going to be Curse Implock. Honestly, I think it might be a little bit better than Beast Druid, but only because once you get to higher legend, having that direct damage and a little bit of extra flexibility does give you a few more options in the late game. So I think for new players, budget players, and people who are just, you know, anywhere between Diamond 5 to Bronze, I would say that this deck is probably a little bit worse. But once you get Diamond 5 to Legend, I think it starts shifting a little bit more towards Curse Imp Warlock, especially if you know what you're doing. Overall, the idea is you use the early Imp package to basically dominate the early game, and if that doesn't win you the game straight up by like dropping Rafam at the end of the game, then you can destroy them with curses by playing Abyssal Wave, Zakul, as well as Dragged Below and the Cultist, and you can do, you know, 10, 20, 30 damage and curses easy over the course of a game. So the next deck on the list is going to be Naga Priest, which pains me to say because it is my least favorite deck in the entire game, but it is super duper strong, so it deserves to be on the list. I'm going to try to not let my bias get too in the way. Overall, the deck has some pretty good mid game. The early game is a little bit weak, but if you can get Serpent Wig in your hand and a couple of cheap amalgams, even that is pretty strong. You really start popping off when you can play Radiant Elemental, a couple of Nagas along with the Priestess, and obviously you want to play a ton of Serpent Wigs, regain all of your mana, play a couple more Nagas, and then play Boon of the Ascended. Usually you're able to do all of this around turn 5, and you can pretty easily get like 2 15, 17 minions out there, one of which has Taunt, and the ability to continue to scale if Radiant Elemental survives the board until next turn. Overall, this deck is absolutely phenomenal and snowballs really hard, but is sometimes a little bit difficult to play. So next on the list is going to be Ramp Druid. Not the taunt variation, although I do think that's very good as well. This is just a personal preference. I like the more standard old school version of Ramp Druid more that revolves around Denathrius and Jailer. You're on the new card, Spreading Plague, because it helps stall you a ton. It's basically a slightly cheaper option of Scale of Onyxia, which is exceptionally good. Like, let's say you only get 1 ramp card. Now, instead of immediately dying because you don't have 7 mana and you can't play Scale, you can play Spreading Plague, stall out for like 1 more turn, and actually be fairly fine. Overall, this deck is really, really good. You can make some tweaks to it, especially if you want to play the taunt version, but both of them run basically the exact same way. You ramp up, have a couple of different late game win conditions, then you want to close out the game with Sire Denathrius or a couple of big minions. So the next deck on the list is going to be Aggro Demon Hunter, which quite honestly is one of the best decks in the game, has a 54% win rate, which is funny because before this patch, much like Enrage Warrior, it was complete and total garbage and saw basically no play. Now, even though it got no new cards, is dominating the meta. And it probably has to do with the fact that people realized how broken a 3-mana weapon that does 3 damage per attack that draws you a ton of cards is, paired with the fact that you have a 4-mana 5/4 that draws you multiple cards and usually only draws your opponent 1 if not 0. And then you have decent late game because of Kurtrus and the fact that that hero power scales pretty well with a wide board. And if you want to, you can also run Jace Darkweaver instead of one of these cards, hypothetically Dread Prison Glaive, so you also have another late game win condition. This deck is just extremely fast, consistent draw, and isn't even that weak late game. So the next deck on the list is going to be Control Paladin. I still run the version with Cariel, but some people like to run the version with Uther as well as the Jailer and try to get all 4 horsemen. Both of them actually work. But I think Cariel is significantly better. The idea of this deck is pretty simple. You just want to play tempo for most of the game, and then if you're able to play equality city tax, if your opponent floods the board or something, you can do that. That's where the control comes in. And then once you hit late game, you take half damage, have insane healing with Rag and Reno, and then also have the Jailer and Denathrius as big late game healing bomb cards that just ultimately win you the game. Next is going to be Fel Demon Hunter. This is basically Relic Demon Hunter, but instead of having a couple of big late game win conditions like Denathrius and whatnot, it revolves around Jace being reduced in cost, double activating him with Bran, and getting a ton of Fel spells. This deck has insane draw. This deck can also use Bran to get multiple extra cards off of something like the School Teacher, which is pretty good, so you don't always have to use him with Jace, so you have some cool mid-game plays. And also you have the Artificer and Xylag and Kurtrus as 3 other legitimate late game win condition cards. The only issue with this deck is the fact that it doesn't really have a great early game. So if you're playing against a lot of aggro decks, this might not be the best one for you. But overall, I would still say this is one of the better decks. And if you are playing against a lot of aggro, you can pretty easily play 1 or 2 Topple the Idols and you'll be fine. Now we're getting into the 2 decks that are mostly fun, but still very, very good. And the first one is Miracle Rogue. You could just play a ton of cards, get a giant stealth minion and or a giant weapon. It's not the most consistent. It is pretty draw dependent, but it's super fun to play. I think the most fun I've had playing the game in recent memory was when I was playing Miracle Rogue, popping off. I think I got a 17 attack weapon one of the games and destroyed them over the course of 2 turns. It's so much fun, along with also having a 17/17 stealth minion. It's just, I had an absolute blast playing this deck. You do have to realize, though, that there are going to be some games where you just draw really poorly and you just lose, and that's fine, because like 25% of the times, that's going to happen. But if you can learn how to master this deck, the other 75% of the games are like 100% winnable if you know what you're doing. Last but not least is another guilty pleasure deck of mine. I think this is my most favorite deck overall. If Miracle Rogue is not it, it has to be this one. And it's just Phylactery Warlock. I've loved this deck for a long time. I didn't like it when it was super duper strong, but after meta shifts and like think 1 or 2 nerfs, it definitely became a lot more fun to me. You can run this in a couple of different versions. You could run this version along with the Shellfish if you want to make them draw a bunch of cards. You can also run this with the Owl if you want, although it's a little bit slower. It could potentially do more damage, which can be fun. Overall, there are multiple different ways you can use the Phylactery combo to win. You could also use the Phylactery combo in a 40 card, like more control version of the deck. I don't think it's as good, but it can still work if you are playing against a lot of aggro and you think the 10 HP will be necessary. Overall, I had a blast playing this deck. I have a blast playing most of the decks in the game right now. And if you like the video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out a ton. And stay tuned because basically every single one of these decks has a video or will have a video shortly.